Welcome to this webinar. We're excited to bring you a webinar and hope you'll get some insight into this about honesty and integrity. First, I want to talk about our developmental philosophy. We believe that great leaders are people that have done a few things well. That's what made them great. In fact, when Jack and I first looked at the data and we identified extraordinary leaders, we found out they had a few strengths. It was not the absence of weakness that made them great, but it was the presence of a few profound strengths. From that, we identified this idea that 70 to 80% of leaders they're better off focusing on their strengths than working on their weaknesses. And that philosophy and that understanding, when we first came to it, caused us to ask the question, well, how do you build a strength? How do you do it? Is it the same way you fix a weakness, or is it different? Now, there's some schools of thought that are very different about strengths itself. And while there's a group of organizations that talk about strengths and the importance of strengths, the school of thought ends up being very different. There's one school of thought that a number of people talk about strengths as more of an inherent ability. Part of that philosophy indicates that strengths are developed at a very early age. You've heard the term fixed at 6. Sigmund Freud was actually the first one to talk about this philosophy, and others might extend that a bit to 16, but basically, the idea is at a very early age, you center in and you really become aware of what you're good at, and these strengths are there at that age, and they tend to talk about them in a way that they're sort of hardwired. The philosophy indicates that if you work really hard on a weakness, you can only get incremental improvement. You really can't do much to change it. And so that, with that philosophy and that idea that strengths are something that you have, that they're developed at an early age, what the philosophy of strength building is the key is to figure out what your strengths are and then leverage them to sort of find jobs where you can utilize your strengths and position yourself around your strengths. And this is the tough part of that philosophy. You can't be really good at anything else. You're fixed. And if you've got it, you've got it. If you don't, you don't. And it's sort of tough beans. Well, there's a different philosophy, and it's one that we adhere to, and it is that strengths can be developed over time. Now, as we look at the data, we do recognize that some of our abilities, some of our talents, some things appear to be inherited or inherent, and we'd say that might be about 30%. We sort of come with certain characteristics, but we think that 70% of what we have they're malleable. They are things that we can bend or move with or adjust. We find in that data, and evidence is mounting on the strong correlation between expert performance and practice. All you have to do is practice 10,000 hours to be great at something. And so that piece of evidence seems to strongly suggest that people can develop strengths and learn new skills and capabilities. Well, as we thought about that, the Zinger-Folkman approach is that we have absolutely clear data to show from our research that leadership competencies can be developed and improved at any age. And we're going to show you some of that evidence at the end of the webinar here today. But one of the things we found is that the approach to strength building, the way you build a strength is very different from how you fix weaknesses. And one way to illustrate that is with an example we use often around running. Now, usually in a session, we talk about this as linear development, and I'll ask if someone's a runner there, and usually someone volunteers, and I have them stand up, and I ask them how far they run a week. And this last week, I asked someone, and he said 20 miles. And I said, well, is this give me the level that you are. Are you pathetic? Are you okay? Are you pretty good? And he said he was okay. And I said, well, do you have any advice for those of us in the room that don't run at all? Anything we could do to improve? And he looked at me with that kind of face that you look at when someone asks a really stupid question, because his response was, start running. Okay. So what's interesting is that the way you go from pathetic, which is what everybody else was, to good is you start running. You run. And I said, well, you run 20 miles a week. Let's say you wanted to go from okay to really pretty good. How many miles would you run a week? And he said 40. And so then I said to him, well, there appears to be a correlation between your ability to run, or the number of miles that you run, and your ability, such that the more you run, the better you are. And he said, yeah, that's really true. If you don't run at all, you're not good at all. But if you're running 40 miles, you're pretty good. Well, the next question is, well, what would happen if you wanted to win a marathon, if you wanted to really do well, incredibly well? Would it be good training advice to run 200 miles a week? Now, he responded very quickly. He turned to me and said, absolutely not. I said, why not? I thought there was a correlation between the number of miles you ran and your ability. And he said, to a point. But at some point, running more miles just wears you out. You see, that's interesting, because as you talk to the runners and you say, so how do you go from good to great? How do you get great at running? What they start talking about is something called cross-training. They oftentimes say they'll lift weights or bicycle or swim or do yoga. That these other activities actually help them build strength and build capability without wearing their body out. See, the athletes have figured out there's a linear way to go from bad to good. It's really running more miles, but there's a point where running more miles kind of just wears you out. It doesn't move you to the next level. Well, we ran into a case study recently where we looked at some data, and we looked at a series of our 16 differentiating competencies for this organization, and the number one highest rated competency for this organization was displays integrity and honesty. They were rated pretty high in that, not great, but they were good, clearly good in it. And then we looked at their importance rankings. In our 360 data, we're able to assess how important each competency is as rated by the raters. And it turns out the number one important competency was also on honesty and integrity. And this seemed like a really good challenge for us, because this was something they were good at, but they thought it was very important. The organization was critical. And so the feeling was, we want to move from good to great. How do you do that? Now, it's interesting when you think about honesty and integrity. Let's say that someone has a definite weakness, really a strong weakness in honesty and integrity. Would it be difficult for them to figure out what they could do to improve? Well, I don't know. You could stop lying, quit cheating, or start walking your talk. I mean, if you're really bad at this, it's pretty easy to figure out how to get better. I mean, this is low-hanging fruit. Again, if you're not running at all, it's not too difficult to figure out how to get better. Start running. Now, let's say that in this organization, as you can see from the data, that was not a weakness. They were really pretty good at it. So then you start saying, so what would you do to go from good to great? How would you help people go from good in honesty to great in honesty. And intuitively, people think about that and they start coming up with things like, well, be really honest, or be really, really honest, or my favorite one, be honest harder. Well, as you probably can figure out, that doesn't really work. I mean, you really end up sort of with nothing to do, because all those things are platitudes, but there's no real action plan there, and no real defined way to move from good to great. What we did when we came up to this problem is we looked at leaders who had a profound strength. And in this case, we analyzed data from 236,000 individual raters who assessed 18,211 leaders. And we found the behaviors that were used by the most honest leaders. We looked at leaders who were really honest, and we said, what did they do? And what we found is that there were some behaviors that helped them to be more honest, and we call these companion behaviors. What the research revealed is that there were 8 companion behaviors associated with honesty and honesty and integrity. And what the companion behaviors do is they seem to be levers. They seem to be the behaviors that enable a person to be perceived as even more honest. And again, these tend to work where people are honest, and you sort of say, but are they really, really, really honest? Because I'm not sure how you do that except for utilizing these companion behaviors. So what I'd like to do in the webinar is to go through these 8 companion behaviors, to describe them to you, to discuss how these work. And as I'm going through these 8, I'd like you to think about which one of the 8 or which of the 2 of the 8 would benefit you or your organization, would help you to actually increase your honesty and integrity. Now, the first companion behavior is concern and consideration from others. And I think that dishonesty is at its roots a lack of consideration. When you think about people that aren't honest, at its very core, they don't care much about another person or other people in general. The motive around a lot of dishonesty is personal selfishness. Several years ago, I was in a foreign country. I went to a meeting, and as we arrived to the meeting, the person that we set the meeting with was not there. So we went into a conference room and waited. We waited 15 minutes, and our person didn't come. We waited 25 minutes, still not there. 30 minutes. Finally, at 45 minutes, the administrative assistant came in and said, he's not coming. And I looked at my colleague who lives in the country, and I said, this is really hard to understand. I mean, we set an appointment, right? Yes. He said he'd be here. Yes. But he didn't show up? Yeah. I said, this has never happened to me. And she looked at me and said, well, this happens here all the time. People set appointments. They tell people they'll be there, but they don't show up. It's interesting because we'd done a fair amount of work in that country, and I looked at the results on these 16 different competencies for that country, and it turns out that displays honesty and integrity was rated 16th, the lowest rated competency, with bosses and peers around the 33rd percentile. Of course, the self data was at the 53rd percentile. They thought they were okay on it. Now, what's fascinating to me is that as you think about honesty and integrity, and this country was struggling with lots of social problems, corruption at many levels, police being bribed and things like that. The question I started to wonder about was, does this start? Is the roots of these societal issues? Does it start with people saying they're going to be to a meeting and not showing up? I mean, is that the basis for people kind of acting it out in more significant ways, in bribery and things like that later on? And as I thought about that, I thought about a situation that maybe you've encountered where you're sitting in your office one day and one of your direct reports comes in and they sit down and they look at you and they say, "How am I doing?" Well, what's your answer? I mean, lest you think that, oh, we don't do that. I think that there are many of us that tend to say, "Oh, you're doing fine." You pat the person on, "You're doing great." They're not. But we aren't honest with them. If you really cared, if you really were concerned, if you had high levels of consideration, you'd be honest. And you let people know where they stand, and you wouldn't tell them you're doing fine when they're not. So I do believe this is a test for all of us. And the test is, if you really care about other people, can you be honest with them and direct and tell them what you really think? And that's really a test of honesty for many of us. The second companion behavior for integrity and honesty is trust. Now, it's interesting because trust is a key component. If people don't trust you, they don't believe you're honest with them. So the question is, how could I increase the level of trust? What can I do to be trusted more? And this is a hard thing because people want to just look at people and say, "Well, just trust me." Well, we found that there's 3 pillars that really help a person become trusted more. The first pillar is positive relationships. We tend to trust people we like. We distrust people we don't like. And so we found that there's this positive correlation between the extent to which you're trusted and the relationship you have with another person. So one way you can build trust and hence increase the perception of honesty and integrity is to build the relationship, is to create a more positive relationship with that other person. The second pillar of trust is knowledge and expertise. We trust people that know things, that provide information that's accurate, that help us understand things we don't understand. That relationship helps us to be more trusted. And certainly if you can share more knowledge, and again, that knowledge has got to be right and correct and true, but sharing knowledge and providing people with insight and information and helping others build their own expertise builds trust. The third one is consistency. It's knowing that it's always going to come in the same way, and that when you say you're going to do it, you're always going to do it, and it's walking your talk. And those kinds of things, that consistency, is the third pillar of trust. And those 3 things can help you to be more trusted. The next companion behavior is positive optimism. This is a bit of a curiosity because in some ways, optimists tend to be a little, they tend to build up things a little bit. And this is curious to us. It was for a long time, but as we looked at the research, there's some wonderful research that goes back to 1968 by Rosenthal and Jacobson, where they went into a classroom and what they did was they communicated to teachers that their students were late bloomers. That these students had high potential, they just hadn't shown it yet. And when the teachers believed that the students had high potential, the test scores went up. They do the opposite, where they said these kids are not as bright as you think, and their test scores went down. What's interesting about this process is that positive expectations, the positive optimism, caused the results to change a little bit. The data is really curious that optimists tend to be perceived as more honest, and as I thought about that, I thought, wouldn't the realists, wouldn't the people that just tell you the cold hard facts, wouldn't they be as perceived as more honest? But a lot of times the realists tend to be pessimists. And one of the things about, positive expectations is that they lead to better outcomes. It's a wonderful quote by Winston Churchill. The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. The reality is that the reason why optimists are viewed as more honest is because results get better. And the reason that pessimists get viewed as less honest is results actually get worse. So be a little more optimistic as people expect better results out of people, and you might get it. The third companion behavior, the next companion behavior, is assertiveness. And there's a very strong correlation between the extent to which you're assertive and the extent to which you're perceived as honest. But it's a very different behavior. Most of you know someone who's not very assertive but very honest. Perhaps you know someone who tends to be pretty assertive but dishonest. Well, that's actually a profile for a crook. They tend to be that way. Sharon Watkins is an interesting woman. I keep asking people if they know who she was or is, and very few people know. But Sharon Watkins used to work for Enron. And she did an interesting thing. She saw some accounting data, and she noticed that they were engaged in illegal activity, and wrote an email and was promptly fired. And my question for folks when I talk to them about this is Sharon Watkins the only honest person at Enron? And most people say no. Well, but she's the only one she's one of the few that was honest and assertive. She knew what was right and wrong, but she spoke up and she said something about it. One of the things that's a lot better than a really honest person would be an honest person who's willing to speak up and say it and confront other people when they're not honest. That's much better. And one way that people are perceived as being more honest is when they're more assertive and when they're willing to speak about it and talk about it. As I mentioned, there's an incredibly strong correlation between honesty and assertiveness. We found that if you were in the bottom 10 percentile on assertiveness, you tended to only have honesty percentiles in about the 8th percentile. But if you were in the top 10%, your honesty scores, your perception of honesty and integrity were about the 85th percentile. Boy, that's a very strong correlation there. So one way to really increase the perception and the view of others in your honesty and integrity is speak up, say something, don't let it go. There's two interesting competencies that can really influence and honesty and integrity. If you think if an organization had a problem, if they wanted to improve honesty and integrity, and I ask people about it, let's say your organization had a problem with honesty and integrity, they really wanted to improve, what would they do? And most people say, I know exactly what they do. They would establish a policy. They would do an audit. They would set up rules. They'd enforce the rules. And when you talk about all those issues, it sounds like push. And that competency is actually drive for results. Those pushing behaviors, those things that we do. And it's very important, and it's interesting to think about that. But as you think about, that gets us compliance. And it's very important for compliance. Is there another way to get people to be more honest? And there might be another way. And if push is one way, pull's the other. And that competency is inspiring and motivating. And it's, how would you inspire and motivate people to be more honest? Well, what kind of an organization do you want to work for? One where people are dishonest, where you get lied to, or one where people are honest and they tell you the truth? Who do you want to do business with? An honest organization or one that's deceitful? As you think about the value of honesty and integrity, and how do you inspire people that this is a characteristic that we want to do more? Now, what we were interested in, we've done this research before, but we've never focused on honesty and integrity with it. But we looked at these two behaviors: inspires and motivates others and drives for results. And then the question we wanted to answer was, let's say that you were really inspiring about, honesty and integrity. You were good at inspiring, but you weren't good at drive for results. So we set the bar at the 75th percentile here, and we said, so if you're good at inspiring, but not so good at driving, what's the likelihood that you would be at the top decile in terms of your ability to be honest and in high integrity? And then we found about 9% of the leaders, the probability was about 9%. So then we looked at the opposite. We looked at leaders who were really good at driving, push, rules, regulations, we got to do it. There's a lot of that, but not so great at inspiring. Now, the question here, let's do a little poll. What do you think? Is this going to be higher or lower? And you can see on the right side of your screen, there's a place for you to kind of weigh in on this. Would the push get you better results? Would leaders who pushed, who were better at pushing but not so good at pulling, would they have higher level? Would there be a higher probability that you'd be perceived as in the 90th percentile and inspires and motivates? Well, I see there's votes on both, because I think intuitively if you just ask people on the street, they'd say it would be higher. But of course, a lot of you people think I'm messing with you, so you say lower. Well, it's true. It is higher. It is higher. Again, that drive for results really works. Don't stop that. I think the enforcement part is good. But the interesting thing is that only gets you only 15% of the leaders at the top 90 in the 90th percentile had that. So where do you get the real power here? And it's in doing both. Now, look, if you're good at both, you'd expect 24, but you're going to get much more. And you end up getting 69% who were in the 90th percentile. 69% of those leaders were good at driving. They set the rules. They established, they got the compliance, okay? That's what drive for results gets you. It gets you compliance. But when you think about it, when you think about what great organizations really need, they need more than compliance. They need more than rules. They need commitment. They need people that want to do it, not because they have to do it. They need people who want to do it because it's the right thing to do, because it makes a better organization, because I want to live this way. I want to be in that kind of organization. I want to be in an organization where they tell the truth and they're honest and there's no underhanded deals and double dealing. There's nothing like that. And that's the inspirational ability, the ability to encourage people through the inspiration. And so you need to do both. And what I've found is that, boy, if you give a kid a hammer, he'll find something to beat on. The one we beat on is push. And can you figure out a way to inspire people to be honest? That's an interesting challenge. Well, the next companion behavior deals with ambiguity. And the problem with ambiguity is it can cause others to question a person's integrity. When you never are sure what the deal is, and there's always, you forgot to mention this, but it also, when there's lots of ambiguity, it provides many opportunities for people to break the rules when it isn't straightforward, and then it provides options for people where they can mess with it. Now, people who fail to manage ambiguity well, we looked at the data, we did some research on this, and these are the kind of the things that they don't do well. Number one, they rarely anticipate and respond quickly to problems. Number two, they delay decisions. They put them off. Number three, they fail to communicate a definite sense of direction and purpose, so people aren't sure where you're going. Number four, they have difficulty making decisions, so they tend to balk. Number five, they lack the courage to take bold measures. Number six, they fail to face up to difficult situations. And number seven, they fail to act with a sense of urgency. Again, the roots of ambiguity are rooted in these kind of behaviors. And as you try to sort of say, I'm trying to make these situations less ambiguous, these kind of behaviors cause it. And so if you're engaging in those, you're probably engaged. There's probably a lot of ambiguity you're surrounded by. There's a strong correlation. Another companion behavior is decisiveness. And what's interesting is that when decisions are delayed, people start to ask questions. I spend a fair amount of time in airports. I'm usually there every week somewhere. And occasionally there are delays. As you and I both know, there's lots of delays. Now, I know that delays are just part of travel, and I've done it long enough that it's not a big surprise. But let me tell you what I don't like if there's a delay. I don't like the lack of information. And so what's difficulty in a delay is oftentimes people don't have additional information. Here's the thing that I appreciate. I appreciate it when people keep communicating even if there isn't additional information. When I'm sitting on the tarmac for 15 minutes, I want to hear something. And even if it's we don't know what's going on, or there's a weather delay, or there's a gate not open, I want to hear that. Because about any longer than that, and I start going, what's going on, and why is this, and why can't these people move? I want to hear something. And I find that hearing something is a lot better than hearing nothing. If you think about the decision delay process, typically a decision is needed. Then there's a delay and it's not getting made. You might not have any new information. And what people assume is I shouldn't say anything, or it's better not to say anything than to say something. So they don't communicate. They're waiting for new information in order to say something. And this is the wrong approach. What I recommend is that even if you don't have information, communicate something. Let people know you don't have any more information, because they become more frustrated without any information. And on the airlines that say nothing, what I've noticed is that when people get on their plane, they're nasty. They're upset. They're angry. And they could have been less angry and they could have been less upset if somebody would have said, here's where we're at, here's what's going on, and communicated with them on a regular basis. It helps to keep communicating even when there's no new information. Well, sometimes people have a difficult time making decisions. So we have another poll that I'd like to get you to respond to. Why do people have difficulty making decisions? Is it the complexity of the information or the lack of knowledge? Is it that they're afraid of what others might think? Is it the fear of being wrong? Or maybe, perhaps, you've never made a bad decision. Can you weigh in on this? And we're going to sort of see what you think about this. Why is it that people have difficulty making a bad decision? Again, on the right side of your screen, you can click the answer you like the best there. Well, unbeknownst to you, this was a lie test, and anybody that answered, "I've never made a bad decision," I now know you're liars because either that or you're really deceived, because we've all made bad decisions. Well, a few of you are messing with me and marking that, but the majority here put the largest percentage here, and all those are, well, the first three are relevant. The fear of being wrong. How many of you have made a bad decision? We all have. And there's a reason for that. The reality is, if you knew all the data and could predict the future, decision-making would be relatively easy. I mean, if you could look into the future and you had all the facts at your fingertips, it's a piece of cake. The problem is that most decisions are based on limited data and only guesses about what might happen in the future. In reality, people that make decisions are predicting the future. So what happens when you make a bad decision? Suppose you want to go buy a car. Well, before the decision is made, people tend to look at all kinds of options, look at weigh the facts, look at reviews. They are very objective, very, very objective before the decision is made, and they're looking at all kinds of brands, and they're evaluating, and they're looking at what's better and what's worse. But over time, they narrow the facts down. They sort of start to test drive the cars, and then at some point they make a decision. Now, that car is the Chevrolet Volt. I want one of those. Those are so cool. It's interesting what happens when you make a decision, because as you make a decision, you suffer something that Fessinger called cognitive dissonance. Again, when you're dealing with all this information and these differences and the differences of opinion, that's great before you make a decision. But once you make a decision and you keep asking yourself, did I make the right decision, and is this the right decision? What he noticed was a tendency for people to narrow down, to start focusing on only the information that supported their decision and kind of ignoring information that didn't, that sort of was the opposite. And maybe you've gone through this cycle. Most of us notice when other people go through this cycle, because they notice that people get real defensive about their decision after they've made it. And the reason is they are afraid they might be wrong. What's interesting is we all make bad decisions. We're all wrong occasionally because we're predicting the future. It's interesting when you think about that. If you look, there's a fascinating study by Philip Tetlock where he studied people who predict the future, and I think we all do, but these were professional predictors. He said the worst characteristic of the worst predictors, the characteristic was the dogmatists, the people that were unwilling to change their minds based on new facts and evidence. Making decisions, you ought to be aware of the tendency to reduce distance by looking at only evidence that supports your decision. You need to remain open to new data. Now, so our tendency is to ignore the new data, and what I would suggest is that we ought to try to remain open, because you're guessing the future, and that's tough to do. One of the ways to be better at making decisions is to remain open and have the courage to change the decision quickly based on new data and new evidence. Now, that's called a flip-flopper, and that gets bad reviews in the political press. Personally, I think people that flip-flop are geniuses because they remain open to new information. Now, again, as you think about these 8 companion behaviors, they really do offer you the process for moving from good to great. What we found is the best leaders, the leaders that were perceived as being the most honest, utilize these companion behaviors. Now, here's the rule of thumb. You can't have a fatal flaw in any one of those, but to really shine, you only need 2 or 3. So for your organization, I guess the challenge is, which of those would do the most to help you or your organization make a significant improvement in the level of honesty and integrity? Well, that's something to think about. And what I'd like to kind of help you understand is there's tremendous impact in leadership development that teaches leaders how to build strengths. It changes development from what's wrong with you to what you can do to be exceptional. Linear development plans, they run out of gas. They get people to good, but they don't get them past that. And it really takes this nonlinear approach. It's a proven process that helps leaders develop profound strengths. And what we've done is we've expanded our set of companion behaviors to not only our 16, we have over 60 different competencies where we've got these companion behaviors analyzed and figured out. So if you're doing development and you're using a linear approach, I think it's a suboptimal process, and we can help you to find a much better process for doing it. Our philosophy and our understanding, our research demonstrates that strength building can produce dramatic improvements. And in an analysis we did on 281 leaders, we found in our pre-test data that this group tested out at the 60th percentile. But by using nonlinear development, strength building, they moved to the 82nd percentile in the post-test. They made, on average, 22 percentile point improvement. They went from good to great. Well, we're confident you can do this too. We're very optimistic that leaders, that individuals can really change their level of effectiveness through understanding this nonlinear process and focusing on developing their strengths. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. If you have questions about these nonlinear behaviors, and if you have a specific competency that you'd like us to share some of this information, we'd invite you to contact us and let us see if we can help you. Good luck in developing your strengths.